Let's get started building our first shortcode. When I'm in a post view, I would like to be able to type Twitter, and it's going to echo out follow me on Twitter, and it's going to create the necessary formatting, the necessary anchor tags that will link to that page. So that will be our very first step. So let's go ahead and create a plugin to allow for that. I will close this out and open up our htdocs folder. And if I go in here, I go to WP Content and Plugins, and this is where all of your plugins will be stored. Now note that they can either be stored in their own directory or they can be stored as single files. That said, it's a best practice to always store your plugins, your shortcodes within their own directories in general. So I'm going to create a new folder called Twitter Shortcode. And I will take that and drag it into my code editor. We begin by creating a new file. And this you can name however you wish. Some people prefer to name it as their plugin name. Some people prefer to call it index. It's all up to you. In this case, we'll keep it simple and call it index.php. Now, in order to make WordPress recognize that we have a plugin here, we need to provide some comments at the very top. We'll do that right here. We begin by saying, what is the name of our plugin? We'll call it Twitter Shower, something silly like that. Next, we'll give it a URI. Where is this plugin stored? Where's the documentation? In this case, let's just bring it to NetTuts. Next, we have a description. Next, we have what is the current version. We'll give it 1.0 for now. And the author is going to be myself and my URI. And again, we'll link to NetTuts. When WordPress comes across this, it'll understand that it is a plugin file, so it needs to then be made available within the dashboard. If I go to Plugins, Plugins, now you'll see Twitter Shower is available. And notice that it has the title, the description, the author, a link to my site, as well as a link to the plugin site and the version number. So make sure that you add this to every plugin you create. In fact, you should store this into a snippets program, and I'm going to do that right now. I use a tool called Snippets, but there are many available. So I'll create a new snippet. I'm going to paste that in, and I will call it WordPress Comments. There we are. That way, whenever I create a new plugin, I can paste that in without having to write it out manually. So now, let's turn our Twitter shortcode into something that actually functions. If I type my test post, and we will preview this, note that at this point, the shortcode simply displays and no processing is happening behind the scenes. So we'll figure out how to fix that in the next lesson. This lesson, we're going to learn how to turn a shortcode into something that actually functions. So let's come back to our editor, and I'm going to type a new WordPress function called add shortcode. Now this shortcode function is going to accept two parameters. The first one is going to be the name of the shortcode. In this case, we called it Twitter. You might want to be a little more specific with it. You could do JW, your initials. It's up to you. For now, again, let's keep it simple, and we'll call it Twitter. Now the second parameter is going to be the function to call, and we have two options here. The first one is going to be the name of a function, so we could call it JW Twitter. On the other hand, if you are building this for your own projects and you're using PHP 5.3 or newer, you could also pass an anonymous function, and you would do it like so. So it's up to you. A couple rules of thumb. If you are going to be building this for many people, that means it's very possible they're not going to be using PHP 5.3, in which case you should use a named function. On the other hand, if this is your own project or it's 2013, 2012, and you want to be able to use this exclusively, feel free to sit with anonymous functions, as I find it a little bit easier to work with. So we'll stick with the 5.3 route for now. So for the time being, let's simply echo out hi. All we want to do here is make sure that it is working. So once again, save the draft, come back, preview it, and we still see Twitter. And why is that? Well, that is because we haven't yet activated the plugin. So let's do that right now. Plugins, activate. And now if we come back and we refresh the page, sure enough, we're getting hi. So now we know that we are successfully running this shortcode. But let's take a look at something else. Let's add some text above it. And then at the bottom, I'm going to write, so let's see how this is going to display. It may not be like you would expect. Refresh. And sure enough, we get hi, and then hello everyone, goodbye. But isn't that interesting, because it should say hello everyone, hi, goodbye. But it's not happening. And that is because this is a common mistake. Within your shortcodes, you do not echo, you return. So let's try it this time. We're going to return the string hi. And now if I refresh the page, this is displaying correctly. So let's go ahead and get rid of this. And now we are going to return an anchor tag which says follow me on Twitter. So I will maximize this and we'll say return an anchor tag which links to twitter.com/EnvatoWebDev, which is my Twitter account. And we'll say follow me on Twitter. Okay, and let's come back, refresh the page, and now we're successfully getting follow me on Twitter with a link to our URL. So this is nice because we can insert our post, and then if at the very bottom you'd like to promote your Twitter feed, you simply insert this shortcode Twitter, and if I refresh, that'll display at the bottom of the page because that's dynamically being parsed. However, what if we want to give some more flexibility? What if you want to have the ability to specify a Twitter account to follow? Well, we can do that with attributes, and we'll do that in the next lesson. In this episode, we're going to expand our shortcode to allow attributes. So let's take a look at how we want to proceed. This time, rather than hard coding in a Twitter account, I would like to be able to type Twitter username equals Envato WebDev. So I will save that, and now let's go into the code and write the functionality for this. Now, when you're creating shortcodes that accept attributes, this function right here will accept a new array, and that will be represented by attributes, but you're free to name that how you wish. Note that this will contain whatever attributes you pass here. So for example, let's try to print R, those attributes, and then we'll die. Come back, refresh, and notice that we now have an array containing the username and the value. Let's do another one. Hello equals world. Now I want you to take note that quotations are optional, but only on the condition that the value is one word. And that is represented by the attributes parameter that is passed. Okay, so now we can use this. Instead of hard coding this in, we will simply echo out attributes, and we gave it the name username. So let's save that, and if I come back and I refresh the page, we have one syntax error, and it's on line 12. And of course, I forgot a closing parentheses. So let's try that one more time. And now, can you see follow me on Twitter? And we're still getting that URL. So now, let's change it to another Envato site, Envato PSD. If I save that, refresh it, now if I click on it, it's successfully linking us to Envato PSD. So great, that's adding a lot more flexibility. But there's one problem. What if they just do this? Let's see what happens. Refresh. And now we're getting a URL simply to twitter.com. Because no username was passed, this was not displayed. So it simply links to this URL. So why don't we try to set a default? And we're going to do it a quick way for now, and then we're going to improve upon it in the next lesson. So we'll say if not is set attributes username. In that case, attributes username is going to be equal to Envato WebDev. So what we're doing here is we're looking for a key of username within the attributes array. And if that's not set, if that doesn't exist, then let's go ahead and set it ourselves, and we'll set a default to Envato WebDev. Now I want you to note that this will work, but there's actually a better way that we'll take a look at shortly. But for now, let's see if that does the trick. Refresh, and once again we have a default, but if we apply a custom username, Envato 3D, and now we refresh the page. Now, if you look at the bottom left-hand portion of the screen, we're linking to Envato 3D. Okay, so in the next lesson, let's see if we can take this a step further, give the user the ability to override the default text that displays here. In this lesson, we are going to provide the flexibility to override the text that displays here. So I'm going to go back to the post, and we would like to be able to type, please follow me, everybody. And now we can close it like you might be familiar with HTML. So we open it, we add some content, and then we close it. So if I save that, whenever you do this, a new parameter will be passed here, and we'll call that content. And once again, let's print our content just to see what's coming through. Refresh. And now, can you see that that value is being sent through? So now we have follow me on Twitter. Let's get rid of that. And this time we will send through content. Refresh. And now, Can you see please follow me, everybody? But then once again, we have the same problem. What if they do the shorthand version? We come back. Now we're not going to get anything because we have not provided a value. Content is null at this point. All right, so let's go with this thinking that we did above. Why don't we create another one? And we'll say if not is set, and in this case we'll do empty. If this content variable is empty, in that case we'll say content equals follow me on Twitter. Now we're providing a fallback. Refresh, and now we have a link, but now we've provided more flexibility, and that is the key to creating effective plugins, is providing flexibility. Now they can override this, as you can see right there. So granted, this is a very simple example. In real life, you would probably stick with an anchor tag, but we're going to keep taking this further to provide more and more flexibility. In this lesson, we are going to fix what we have here. As you can see very quickly, this could become tedious if we're having to check for a value for every single attribute. And in fact, there's a better way by using shortcode attributes, which is a WordPress function. So I'm going to delete this. And we're going to use a function called shortcode atts. And what this allows us to do is to set default values for our attributes array. But then anything that the user types within here will override our default options. And that's perfect for what we need. So within here, we will set an array. Shortcode attributes accepts an array as the first parameter. And as the second parameter, it wants to know what we're comparing against. So in this case, we're comparing against attributes. So let's set our defaults. The first one is going to be, and we don't have many, the first one will be username, and we're going to set the default to Envato WebDev. Now, while we don't have to do this, why don't we make things nice and clean, and we're going to set the next parameter equal to content. Now, the reason we're doing this is because otherwise we would have to check whether content was empty or not. So we're going to group it into our shortcodes attributes. And we'll say, if it's not empty, then return content, otherwise follow me on Twitter. So what we say here is find this content, and if the user didn't add anything, if nothing was passed, in that case, display follow me on Twitter. But if it's not empty, meaning something was passed, then just assign this back to content. It's just an easy way to group these together. Now, we've called the shortcode attributes function, but we haven't stored what was returned. So we need to make sure that we store that. Some people will choose defaults. Some people will store that in a variable called options. I like to override what we have already. That way I don't have to keep track of multiple variables. So in this case, we are saying attributes, we're going to override what this has. And we're going to override it by running the shortcode attributes function. And we're going to pass in that array. And that's going to all be changed and modified and stored in that same variable. The next step is we can still reference these array keys like so, but if we'd prefer, we can call an extract function, and this is available with PHP. It accepts a single parameter, and what it does is it goes into an array and it takes all of the keys and makes those values available as variables. So rather than attributes username, extract gives you the ability to do username. It extracts all those variables and values out from an array. It's very helpful, especially when working with shortcodes. So now, why don't we change this? I'm going to switch this to double quotes, and the reason I'm doing this is because within double quotes, you then have the ability to nest variables, and I'll show you what I mean here. So now, we'll get rid of all of this, and I'll type username. And the value will be content. Isn't that much cleaner? So let's try this out. I'm going to come back, refresh the page, and we have follow me fools. It links. But now let's get rid of all of this and simply type Twitter and see if the defaults take effect. Refresh, come down, and now it says follow me on Twitter, and it links to Envato WebDev, and it's receiving these default values. If we change it, username equals my Twitter account, save it, and this time it's now linking to my Twitter account. So this is important when you're creating shortcodes. Always provide a set of defaults. Don't assume that the user is going to pass an attribute. So we set our defaults, and then we call the shortcode attributes function. And that says, take your defaults, but what attributes they type in the WordPress post panel, those values will override our defaults. And then we take that new array and we assign it into this variable. Then we extract the array so that each of the keys in the array are available as simple variables, and we return our new URL. And this gives us a lot of flexibility. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to take things to the last step and build a full project that will bring in tweets, and then we'll even allow for a makeshift form of caching, so stay tuned. Now that we've learned the basic method for creating shortcodes and attributes, let's take it to the next level to do something actually practical. What we want now is when I type in the Twitter shortcode, not only will it echo out a promotional sentence, but it's also going to display a handful of tweets from the account that I specify. So this isn't as simple as it might sound, because think of it, all APIs, including Twitter, they have a limit. And that means every time when you load this page, and imagine we get hundreds of clicks per hour, that means that we have to make a call to the Twitter API, and very quickly we're going to surpass our limit. Not to mention an additional HTTP request with every click. It's not the smartest idea, particularly when we're dealing with mostly static content. We don't need to refresh it on every click. What if instead we could cache that and only refresh it, say, once an hour? We're going to take a look at doing that in this final project lesson. Let's get started. We're going to come here and we have our shortcode, and we can keep a lot of this. So we call our shortcode Twitter. We accept the attributes as well as any content that is passed, and we override that, but I want to add a couple more here. We want to make the ability to display tweets optional. So I'm going to create one called show tweets. And if they create this attribute and provide any value, that'll be equal to true. But by default, it's going to be false. We're not going to display anything by default. Okay, and the last one I want is tweet reset time. So we're building a little plugin here, really, and we're going to set that to 10 minutes. And what this will translate to ultimately is how often do we want to refresh and grab the latest entries from a Twitter feed. By default, we're going to do it every single 10 minutes. If you need it to be an hour, you would up that to 60 or 30. Next, we extract all of these array keys into their own variables. And now we need to run a new method, and I'm going to bring this down so we can zoom up a bit. And we're going to say if show tweets, then tweets is going to be equal to, and we're going to call a new function that we'll create, and we'll call this fetch tweets. So what we're saying here is if they passed a value, or more or less if the blogger included this attribute, so let's come back. If they do something like this, then we know in that case we need to go ahead and grab some tweets. All right, so let's create that right now. Function fetch tweets. Now, let's consider what this function needs to accept. Well, first of all, we need to know how many tweets should we fetch. So we'll do that, and we'll accept that as num tweets. So that should be another thing we should include is whether or not to show the tweets, how often to fetch new tweets, and the number of tweets to bring in. So num tweets. And by default, I'm going to set that to 5. We'll display the 5 most recent tweets. All right, so we're accepting that. The next step is we need to know the username of the account that we're accessing. All right. And the last one will be the tweet reset time. So now that we know that this function needs to accept it, let's make sure that we pass those in. Now again, I want to stress that we can access these array keys, username, show tweets, num tweets, as variables because of this extract function, which allows for that. In order to allow for caching, we can take advantage of WordPress functions called get post meta, delete post meta, and add post meta. So what this does is we can attach data to each post in our database, and we can attach anything we want. In this case, we'll probably attach a HTML fragment which contains our tweets. So I want you to keep that in mind. So we'll begin by first, we need to use PHP's curl functionality to grab our latest tweets from the Twitter timeline. Now you can research the Twitter API if you want, but it's fairly simple. If we run this bit right here, twitter.com/statuses/user timeline/ the username, the Twitter username.json, and we can also do XML if you'd prefer that response. And this will contain all of the data about the account as well as the text of our recent tweets. So this is very helpful now. We can use this URL structure, and I'm going to be working with JSON in this case. So now, with that in mind, we could create the curl functionality all within this fetch tweets, but that's sort of a bad practice. Think of your functions in the same way you would think of writing a paragraph of text. So more or less one idea per function. So let's create a new function, and this will be for our curl idea. So tweets is going to be equal to curl, and within parentheses, I want to pass the URL that we're going to fetch. Now, what we have here is fine, but we're hard coding in my username. And of course, we want to give the user the ability to override that. So with that in mind, I'm going to change this to double quotes, and that way I can nest variables, like so. Tweets equals curl, and then we're going to access whatever username is passed in. So now that we've called curl, let's create that function. We know this function will accept the URL that we passed in right here. So now we will say C equals curl init, and we can pass in an optional parameter, and that's going to be the URL to access. Next, we're going to set a handful of options, so we'll call setOpt. What are we setting the options on? This C variable. The next parameter is going to be what is the option that you would like to set. And if you search for PHP curl, you'll come across a page that contains every single option, and there's a few dozen of them at least. But the ones we want are going to be curl opt, return, transfer, and we're going to set that to 1. This here means, are we going to immediately echo out what is returned, or are we going to transfer that into a variable? If that is the case, 1 will be used. In this case, 1 equals true. Next one is, and I will copy this to save myself some time, connect timeout. And what this means is we don't want it to go on endlessly trying to connect. We need to give it a timeout period. And we're going to time out after 3 seconds. And the last one we're going to do is a standard timeout. So even once it's connected, if there is a problem, we want it to time out, and we'll set that to a generous 5 seconds. And now we've done it. So we will do return JSON decode curl exec. So this is simply a way that we are combining 2 lines into one. If you wanted, you could execute the curl like so, and you could store that result in a variable. But then we need to make sure that we are receiving JSON, so we need to tell PHP to decode that JSON. So we could run JSON decode result, and we could return that. But what we're doing here is we're combining that all into one single line, and it saves a little bit, and it's just as easy for me personally to read. Okay, so now we've successfully accessed our timeline. We are now storing our tweets within this variable. So let's print R and see what we got back. Save that, and I'm going to come back and refresh. And sure enough, we have an object, but there was an error. So let's see what it is. And it's because we're still trying to access that fake account from a previous lesson. So I'm going to change this back to Envato WebDev. Or, remember, that is the default. If I want, I could just as easily get rid of it entirely. And now we'll try it one more time. And sure enough, we're getting this huge object back. So why don't we make this easier to read? And if we wrap it within pre-tags, it'll format it much more nicely. And now, can you see, here is the object that is returned. So now we have lots of data we can work with. Let's continue on. We're going to say for each tweets as tweet, echo tweet text. So where are we getting tweet text? Notice each one of these. So let's go into this first object. And notice that we have in reply to lots of information about the data, lots of information about the user, the Twitter account. But if we come down to the bottom, you're going to see another one called text. Now we can access any of these properties of the object by doing this syntax. Object name, arrow, and then the value. So in this case, if we want to grab in reply to user ID, we would simply do that. But let's try this out. So I'm going to remove all of that, and let's see what happens now. Refresh the page, and now can you see that we just have an endless string of all of my recent tweets. So I want to store all of these tweets because ultimately we're going to build up an HTML fragment that we're then going to cache. So let's do that now. I'll create a variable called data, and actually that'll be an array. And now instead of echoing it out, I'm going to add that information to the array. Data equals tweet text. So now add a new item to the array and make that equal to the tweet. Remember, we had this option to specify the number of tweets. Right now, it's going to grab as many as it can, and that default is maybe set to 10 or 15. So we have this number of tweets. So why don't we do this at the very top, and we'll say if number tweets equals 0, then break. So we're running through this, and we're going to ultimately reduce the number of tweets by 1 for each occurrence. And here we're saying if it's now equal to 0, then we're done. Break out of this for each statement. And here at the bottom we'll say num tweets minus minus. And what this will do is it's going to take that number, and by default that's going to be 5, and every time through the for each statement it's going to reduce it by 1. We can actually combine this. So if I were to do it up here, we're getting the same effect. We read the value of number of tweets and we find out if it's equal to 0, and then we reduce it by 1. Now, if you've ever seen the minus minus come in front, this means first reduce this variable by 1 and then read the number. And that's not what we want in this case. So at this point, we're ready to build up our HTML fragment and save it as metadata for the specific post that we're adding the shortcode to. In this case, it would be the post with a number of 6 or an ID of 6. But now we need to think, how are we going to cache it? There's lots of different ways to cache, but if we're going to use this quick way of caching, we need to do something where we can decide, okay, we're going to cache this every 10 minutes, 20 minutes, or every hour, or what is set by default with tweet reset time. In this case, we set it to 10 minutes. So we need to figure out a way to check the current time. And we'll say when a page is loaded, if the current time is 10 minutes or more from the last time these tweets were attached to the post metadata, in that case, we need to go ahead and update it and fetch new tweets. So let's do that now. Let's attach the current minute that the post was last. Now we'll go ahead and add the first item of the array, and that is going to be the current minute. So when this page is run, it'll be the current minute, and that will be inserted into the database. So let's say the current minute is 3:32. 32 will be attached into the database. Then, when the page is loaded later by anyone else, we're going to run and say, is it 3:42 or later? If it is, we need to get new tweets. But if it's 3:37, it's only been 5 minutes and we can still use the cached tweet. We will go ahead and store that current minute. And we can do this by running date I time. This is a nice little trick to run. When you call date and you pass in time as the second parameter, it's going to use the current time as the basis. And then we can use a handful of different key symbols. In this case, I refers to the minute. If you need to know more, you can simply search for PHP time, and it'll give you a huge list of your options, whether you want to display the hour, the month, the second, the day, the year. In this case, lowercase I will refer to the 2-digit minute of the current hour. So now we've created a new array and we've made it equal to the current minute. In this case, it would be 3:33. But one thing to be aware of is 33 will be the string 33, not the integer 33. So I'm going to fix that right now and make sure I cast that to an integer. Next, let's build up our fragment. So we want to display our tweets within an unordered list. So we'll do that right now. Recent tweets, and we're going to add a new item to it, and that's going to be equal to first a UL, and let's go ahead and give it a class name just in case the user wants to style it. And I'm going to use JW tweets. Next, we're going to have a list item. And here's a trick you can use. Rather than doing another for each statement, you can use implode. And what implode will do is it's going to take an array and turn it into a string. But the first parameter you pass to implode will be, what do you want to use as the separator? So often you'll do a comma, and that'll turn an array, and it'll echo out all of the items in that array as a string, with each one being separated by a comma. But watch what happens if we use a closing list item and an opening list item as the separators. The second parameter for implode is going to be, what array are we working on? Put that in right there. And then finally, let's close out our last list item and close out our closing UL. So this is a way to get rid of a for each statement. You create your opening UL, you create the very first list item, and then you take all of those items in the array and you echo them out, but each one is going to end with a list item and an opening list item. And then when you get to the very last one, we just need to close that last list item and close out the UL. Good, so now we have this array. Let's go ahead and cache this and attach it to the post. That way we don't have to stress out the Twitter API every single time somebody loads our page. Once again, going with the each function gets its own idea, we'll create a new function and that'll be called cache. Now, what are we caching? We're going to cache the recent tweets. Let's create that function now. Function cache, and that's going to accept the recent tweets. So now at this point, I want you to remember that recent tweets is an array. The first one is going to be equal to the current minute, and the second one is going to be equal to the tweet HTML fragment. So first, to attach post data, we can call the WordPress function add post meta. Now this function is going to accept 3 parameters. The first one it needs to know is what is the ID of the post that we're attaching meta information to. Well, we can grab that, but first we need to go up and say global. Go up and get the global ID for the post. We need to provide a name to this metadata. We'll call it JW recent tweets. You can name that anything you want. It's simply an identifier. And next, what are we adding? Recent tweets. So when this function runs, it's going to get the global ID for the post, and we're going to attach this array to the current post, and we're going to assign an ID of JW recent tweets to it. And now we're done. So let's come back up. And now we've successfully cached that information. The last step is we need to return. So I will return, and we need to figure out how we're going to do this. For now, if we want to return this fragment, we need to return not recent tweets, because remember, recent tweets is an array. Instead, we want to return the first item in it, not the 0 item, the first. And that will be equal to this fragment that you see right here. So let's try this out alone. Reload the page, and now we do get a parse error, unexpected semicolon on line 41. And what we can see here is it came to a semicolon when it was expecting another closing parentheses. So if we look through all of this, we have date, and we open it up. Then for the first parameter, that's fine. Then for the second parameter, but we never closed that opening paren. So let's close that now and try it again. So now it seems to not be working. It seems that we're doing that right here, but note we're returning recent tweets from the fetch tweets. So now if we go back, what function called fetch tweets? This right here, that is being stored within tweets. We just need to attach this fragment to what we already have here. So we'll return tweets, and then maybe we'll also store this follow me fragment within its own paragraph tag. So let's try this out. I'm going to refresh the page, and sure enough, we have our post, and then we have a list of recent tweets. So you can run this here, my tweets. And now, anyone who uses this shortcode can simply call the Twitter shortcode and pass in show tweets, and they're getting it. Now, what I want you to be aware of, though, is every single time we are fetching those tweets from the API, and you're not going to be able to do that over and over, especially if you have a decent amount of traffic. Even though we have attached, if we come down to the cache function, even though we've added post metadata, we're doing that every single time. Now, when the page loads, we need to see if there's any metadata available for us, because if there is, and it hasn't been too long, then we never need to run this curl function and we can load the page much more quickly. So we'll do this at the very top. Recent tweets is going to be equal to get post metadata. Now note, this is a similar functionality to what we have here. Here we're adding it. Here, we're retrieving it. If we wanted to delete it, we would call delete post meta. Once again, we pass in those 3 parameters, the ID of the post. Next, we need the identifier. So I will copy and paste that in, and there we go. Now again, because we're getting the post ID, let's make sure that it's available to us. So we'll do global. So now let's try this out. Let's print our recent tweets, and let's die, because all we want to see is what comes out from that. Refresh the page, and we have a quick syntax error on line 33. And of course, it's because I have an incorrect $sign there. One more time, and this is what we're getting. Now, if I load this page, I want you to take note of something. It seems that we have all of these items. How come? Why is this happening over and over? Shouldn't there just be one set? And it's because if we scroll down, we're adding post meta, and we keep adding and adding and adding to it. We could call update, or we could pass an optional 4th parameter, and that is a Boolean, which indicates whether it should always be unique. And I'm going to pass true as the 4th parameter. Again, alternatively, we could use update post meta. So now let's go ahead and reset this. So what we can do here is copy that and call delete post meta. And what this is going to do is it's going to remove anything attached to that key. So we can start from scratch. Refresh, and now if we get rid of it, run it again, we have one set of tweets. And if we refresh the page, it should be new every time. Every time I refresh the page, we have a unique set. Now this works, but we have to think about what if it's the very first time the page loads? In that case, there is nothing attached. So that is going to return nothing to recent tweets, and we're not going to have anything to filter through. So that's the next step, is finding out if it is set and whether or not it's been 10 minutes or more. So we're going to call a function to do it because that is its own idea. And this function name will be called reset data. And we're going to pass in our recent tweets array as well as the tweet reset time, because that's the amount of time to cache. So let's run that right now. And remember, we can name these however we like, but I find keeping the same names helps me a bit. Now, again, we're going to be working with the post ID, so let's go ahead and fetch that. And next, let's first find out if recent tweets exists. But first, let's print R so we can see exactly what we're working with again. And I believe we called that reset data, right? Correct. This is what we have. It's an array. The first item in the array is an array as well, and that's because when you attach post meta, it gets all stored in its own array. So we have an array of arrays. So to access this, we would want to do the array 0, 1. Array 0, 1 is going to be equal to the tweets. Is set recent tweets 0, 1. Now we go just as easily to 0, 0 to find out if the minute. So if you want to do that one, that's fine too. This is equal to the current minute that the post was last attached. So if that is set, then we can work with it. Always make sure you have something to work with. Don't immediately assume that there will be data there. So let's next deal with the delay. And the delay is going to be equal to recent tweets 0, 0 again, the moment that it was last updated, plus the tweet reset time. And again, if we want to be absolutely certain that we are dealing with an integer, we can double that up just in case, just to be sure. So what this is saying is, let's imagine that the post was last attached, those tweets were last attached to the metadata at 4:15. The delay is then going to be 15 plus 10. 25 is now equal to delay. And the next step is to find out if delay is less than or equal to the date, the current time. Once again, we did this function before. And let's make sure we bind that to an integer. If the delay is less than or equal to that, then we need to recache. So we'll say delete post meta ID jw recent tweets. So hopefully that makes sense. I know that can be a little bit confusing. Tweets is 35. So we're saying if the delay, if it's already in the past, meaning if the current time is later than 10 minutes after the post was last updated, okay, it's time to fetch new posts. So we call delete post meta. But I want you to think about it in terms of math rather than in terms of time. For example, the current time is 3:55. So let's imagine that the post was last attached at 55. Well, now we're going to add 10. So 55 plus 10 is not going to be 405, it's going to be 65. And 65 is not the correct time. Let's make sure we fix that really quickly. And we'll say if delay is greater than or equal to 60, then let's make sure that we compensate and we instead say delay minus equals 60. So now let's test that out. Let's say the current time in this case is 56 and the default reset time is 10. So now we're at 66. So now at this point, is delay greater than 60? Yes, because we have 366 when it really should be 406. So in that case, we take the delay and we subtract 60 from it. 66 minus 60 is now 6. So that takes care of the reset data. So we're doing quite a bit here. We're being smart. We've gotten post metadata. We've determined whether we need to fetch new data. So let's next wrap all of this code within an if statement. If no cache, fetch new tweets. And we can do that by running if empty recent tweets. And then we'll go all the way down right here. Don't worry, we're going to go over every bit of this. So let's imagine the page loads for the very first time ever. Recent tweets equals get post meta, but there's nothing attached to it yet. It's never happened. So recent tweets is empty. It's null. It's an empty string. So we're checking that. If it's empty, all right, well, we need to fill that up. So we run curl and we grab the recent tweets. We cache them, which attaches that post meta. And then finally, we return recent tweets. But now the page loads the second time, and this time it's going to run differently. Now we're going to call recent tweets. We're going to get post meta. There is going to be something stored, so that gets assigned to recent tweets. Then we come down here. Is recent tweets empty? No, it's not. So none of this code runs. We don't have to do that extra request. And then we come down and we return recent tweets. So let's test this out right now. We're going to start from scratch. So once again, at the very top, I'm going to delete this and die. That way we can know we're having a very fresh example. And we're getting an unexpected error, and that's just a missing closing paren. Okay, so now we've successfully deleted any post meta information that's attached. So I will get rid of that entirely. And now we're going to try it out from scratch. And what we're seeing here is this array. So maybe we're printing something out. And sure enough, we are. But we have our post, then we have our tweets as expected. So now we're going to refresh the page, and there's already going to be meta information stored. So if I hit refresh, notice that it's loading much more quickly, but it looks like those tweets aren't being displayed. So let's try that out. Right here, let's print our recent tweets, because maybe something is changing. And sure enough, if we come here, now can we see we have an array. So we want to go to the array 0, 1. But here, we just have recent tweets 1 because it's set up differently. In one case, we're displaying the fragment, and then the next case, we're displaying the fragment that was stored within an array in the database. So now we need to check for that, and we can do that quite easily. And we'll say, we'll return is set recent tweets 0, 1. Does that even exist? If it does, then we know that's what we need to return. On the other hand, if that doesn't exist, we're dealing with this initial case where we just have the fragment. And in that case, we'll just return it like so. Refresh, and now we're getting it. But notice it's loading much more quickly. Let's test this out. I'm going to open up a Twitter client, and I've created this new account called Course Testing. So let's change the username to Course Testing, and I'm going to refresh this page. And notice that it's still loading the old tweets. And that's because even though we've changed the account name, we're still displaying from the cache data. So there's a couple of options we could do here. One would be to check for this to see if the account is different. Another one would be to simply wait 10 minutes. Most people won't be changing their Twitter account often. The last option would be to quickly delete the post meta information. And for this demo, I think that's fine enough. So we will delete that and die. Get rid of it, and now we have a fresh attempt. Run the page, it goes to the Twitter API, and it grabs the tweets. And sure enough, you can see right here. Now, when I refresh the page, it loads much more quickly because we aren't grabbing from the Twitter API. Let's try this. Fourth tweet. Even though that's been added, I'm going to refresh. You're not going to see anything until it's been 10 minutes. So what I'll do right now is I'm going to pause for a full 10 minutes so that you can see that take effect. I'll be right back. It's now been 10 minutes, so if I refresh the page, our script should detect that it's been more than 10 minutes since the last update, and it should bring in the latest tweets, which will include fourth tweet. And sure enough, if we scroll down, we are bringing in a new set, and if I refresh, we continue pulling from the cached tweets. And that's it. You've built a very helpful Twitter shortcode that not only caches, but provides the amount of flexibility to allow the user to update their name, modify the number of tweets to bring in, specify how often they need to fetch new tweets. This is quite flexible, and it's really easy thanks to the power of WordPress shortcodes.